And we're so pleased to welcome Professor Hiba Bou Akar with us today for the CRP Spring Lecture. Professor Akar is an associate professor in the urban planning program at Columbia University. She is the author of an award-winning book, For the War Yet to Come, Planning Beirut's Frontiers. And she's working on a new book called Sedimentary Urbanization, which we'll hear a little bit about today. She also leads the Post-Conflict Cities Lab at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And we're so pleased to have Hiba with us here today. Let's give her a warm welcome. And there's plenty of seats, so let's have to kind of sneak in front of the people who are already seated.
Thank you everyone for coming. Good afternoon. I'm really pleased and honored to be part of this initiative that you're having here on campus, the Teach-In Week. And I want to thank Professor Jennifer Tucker and the School of Architecture and Planning, the Department of Community and Regional Planning, and UNM's Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center for the support and for hosting, and to all the faculty, staff, and students who made this event possible. Really grateful. It's my first time in Albuquerque, so I've been excited to be here. So thank you so much. So what I'll do today, so my work is focused on Beirut, but also I would like to speak about Gaza, given that this is what we're all dealing with right now. So I'm going to try to do a tour de force in which I start with my work in Lebanon and then try to connect it to Gaza, and then we can have a conversation about things related to planning, urbanization in conflict cities. Let's see if it works. So the title of my talk today is Sedimentary Urbanization, Displacement, Refugeeness, and the New Geographies of Dead Futures. And so I'll start by talking about the dilemma of urban refugees in general, which brings together Beirut and Gaza in conversation. But in Beirut specifically, thousands of Syrian families arrived to Beirut peripheries seeking shelter away from the war in Syria that started in 2011. Because the Lebanese government refused to establish camps for them, thousands have settled formally and informally in Beirut's periphery since the onset of the senior war. The Syrian refugees arrived to Dahat Aramoun, which is a southeast periphery of Beirut, by following the existing networks of their family members, including those who worked in the construction sector, like the migrant Syrian laborers that have been in Lebanon for many decades. Most of the families I've interviewed for the past 4 or 5 years in this periphery in Beirut, refugees and locals basically live in poverty and in crowded housing conditions. Seeking shelter outside camps, many refugees, especially the mostly economic disadvantaged, became what is known as urban refugees, seeking shelter in unfinished buildings and renting rundown apartments. And basically what's important here is that the category of urban refugees itself has proved to be a challenge for most international aid organizations who do not even after millions and millions of refugees have settled in urban areas, they don't have a clear idea of how to approach the case of urban refugees. But it's about mostly a series of experiments responding to a range of questions. How do we reach urban refugees? How do we find urban refugees? Do we provide? The Zoom is muted. I'm sorry. Do you know how to undo that? They told me to mute it here. Oh, okay, maybe they know that I'm sorry. Okay. Do you want me to unmute?
No, I think they can't hear.
Do you have tech support?
Muted unless they told you to mute it?
Mm-hmm.
Well then, okay. Then
I will unmute it. Let's try.
Test.
Is it working?
I'm assuming so.
Yeah, so we go back to the urban refugees. So the category of urban refugees has created this kind of
dilemma for international organizations. How do they find urban refugees outside of the camp? How do they reach them? Do you also provide aid to host communities,
the poor people where
the urban refugees are living? How do you address then aid gaps between poor refugees and poor locals that cause hostilities among the two groups? How do you figure out if they are in need? How do you support them?
These are among many questions that have shaped how the UNHCR,
the main UN agencies that deal with refugees and other agencies have struggled.
So while I will focus the first part of my talk about my work in Beirut, as you have seen over the past 4 months on your screens and on the news, the extreme case of urban refugeeness in Gaza, where most of the population there, even before the current genocide, were refugees from earlier wars. I will circle back to Gaza at the end of my talk, but first I will take you through my research on refugeeness, displacement, and futures in Beirut. So in this new project, I traced the different urbanization layers of 2 housing modalities in Beirut that became sites of refuge, tracing how these residential spaces have changed over time in the wake of not one war, but several local and regional wars, as flows of displacements ebbed and flowed, as geopolitical conditions shifted between the era of nation building, civil war, and as aftermath, Palestinian refugees, and lately after the influx of Syrian refugees. My investigation begins in Dawhat Aramoun, the site I ended with my first book. The site where I ended my first book for the war yet to come, Planning Beirut's Frontiers. While in the war yet to come, I was interested in understanding how geographies are planned, lived, and practiced within a future that's imagined to be foreclosed. In this project, I continue thinking about the temporalities of planning by moving beyond foreclosed futures to ask what are the possibilities that foreclosed futures might open up for new unplanned futures to emerge, for new forms of living and shelter to occur, arrangements that were not part of the original plan or of past plans. So for the war yet to come, I show basically how in times of peace, religious political organizations have arranged Beirut's mundane peripheral geographies as frontiers geographies within imagined roles in local and regional wars to come. As a theoretical concept, the war yet to come, this anticipation of war, does not treat war and peace as distinct categories by approaching war not as a temporal aberration in the flow of events with a beginning and an end. Rather, it focuses on how war, violence, and their anticipation have shaped Beirut's segregated geography, characterized by ongoing conflicts and environmental crisis. So basically, it's about the reconfiguration of the yet to, of the future. And for those of you who are familiar, like in the planning architecture fields, mostly this yet to is the yet to of progress, of things that are going to get better, that if you just plan or build or manage resources, that things are going to just be improved for everyone. And so this yet to of the future in cities of conflict, contested futures, is a very different yet to than that yet to of what we imagine through urban planning and architecture and building. Is the yet to that anticipates war, conflict, but it's not particular only to Beirut and cities in conflict, because like here, we're dealing also with the yet to of climate change, we're dealing with the yet to of border, of these crises that are on the horizon that we have yet to deal with. So I move in this work from the yet to of the future to that of sedimentary urbanization. So while in the war yet to come, I was interested in understanding how geographies are planned, lived, and practiced within an imagined that's to be foreclosed. In this project, I continue thinking about the temporalities of planning by moving beyond foreclosed futures to ask about these possibilities that foreclosed futures might open up for unplanned futures to emerge, for new forms of living and shelter to occur, that for these new arrangements that I just talked about. So sedimentary urbanization, I'll just go over the concept a little bit and then I'll take you through the case studies I've been working on. So sedimentation, and the reason I use this kind of concept, sedimentation is a process of settling that's the result of multiple processes that move across space and time. Through these processes of sedimentation, actually new geographies emerge. And thinking of it temporally, sedimentation has a long temporal duration during which both the initial geography and the ending geography, the destination spaces, are both reformulated, transformed, and thus opening up the places for new possibilities. I therefore use the concept of sedimentary urbanization to think about what one may call the new geographies of that futures, which call into attention the ways in which the geographies of imagined futures of the past, that of building laws, real estate development, suburbanization, profit, and humanitarian aid, have been reconfigured within the geographies of the civil war, occupation, Syrian war, to become dead futures that open up the possibilities for new modes of habitation and an existence in the city to emerge, especially for those who would not have access to shelter otherwise. So basically, there's a research method. There's a challenge in researching these kind of geographies. So this is a project that is ethnographic, but also archival, trying to bring how people living in the present, how they imagine their futures by thinking about the plans that were developed in the past and they died. And also, I mean, speaking about researching in a city in constant conflict, this is a project that basically bridged or went from the Syrian war to a financial crisis, the global pandemic, to a revolution that happened in 2019, and the worst national economic crisis of the 21st century in Lebanon, where people lost 90% of the value of their currency and banks locked in their savings. So the research method tried to bring the practice and goes over time. So it's a temporal method as well as an empirical method. So back to the housing modalities. In these two housing modalities, excavate the interrelated layers of housing, war, displacement, and it's yet another project through which I'm interested in the spatialities and temporalities of shelter. So what you see here on the screen are the two buildings, or one building, the other is a building project where I've done extensive research in. The first one we'll call Villa Mkahal, and the second one is Zahra project, a synonym for the actual project. So one housing modality I'm studying involves an unfinished single family villa called Villa Mkahal. Its construction was halted at the beginning of the Lebanese civil war, and the unfinished villa has been informally inhabited by 28 Syrian refugee families over a period of several years. Through this villa, I examined 4 arrested futures that you can trace in this picture. So if you just look at the facade of the picture, you can see the bottom is where the original villa was designed. Then you can see the geography of the Syrian occupied, that I will show you the bars. Then you can see the geographies of the new cement blocks, which the refugees have used to build their small shelters inside this one villa. So this one villa has been transformed into a shelter for 28 families. So you see layers of suburbanization, of occupation, of international aid, the pipes that the international aid organizations have installed to facilitate water and sewage provision. And then you can actually trace this on just by looking at the external of the villa. So historically, what happened, and this is the Villa Mkahal in context. So what happened is, so the first layer is suburbanization, and the suburbanization, the villa was designed during the push of suburbanization in Lebanon in the 1950s. That was partially funded by the United States as part of Eisenhower's Point 4 program to combat communism in Lebanon during the Cold War. So for those of you who don't know this history, just Lebanon is a small country in this geography, but that's a very long history where the United States at the time, in order to stop the push to communism in many countries, poor countries around the world, they basically intervened in these countries. And one way they intervened in it is through the suburbanization projects, levy towns, basically. And just to show you that the first boots in the, because we hear a lot about the US Army in the Middle East, actually the first time the United States, US Army landed its boots in the Middle East was in front of Dawhat Aramoun, the area I'm talking about, just on the beach here that you see, and that was in 1958 in the Khaldi region. So this is the first time the US intervened militarily on the ground in Beirut, and it brought with it also a urban planning program, which is like a Leviton that you know here as suburbia, the typology of the first American suburb. And so through these Levitons, basically they try to woo people into out of housing and poverty into a suburban, the comfort of the American dream. And that played into how planners at the time planned the suburbs of Beirut. So this is one schematic from the Ecochar plan. He was a French architect and planner who was planning the suburbia for Beirut, taking into consideration these kind of Leviton logics. And this coincided with Ecochar's mandate to master plan Beirut and its suburb that included a similar version of utopia, low rise and disperse. And this is the area I'm talking about here. And the center of Beirut is up there, and these are the southeast suburbs of the city. So, and there were companies that started that were also influenced by the American logic of suburbanization that took on like areas like Dawhat Aramoun and subdivided the whole area into these, like, as you can see, with a similar logic to the suburban logic that you see here.
So eventually, Dawhat Alamoun became the target of land parcelization scheme that aimed to reproduce a levy town of sorts for the upper income. And there were companies like Seal that land pooled and parcelized the area in the aim of creating a westernized, quote unquote, mode of urbanization, where the suburb is the destination of the higher income. Villas were built in the area that became home to the ambassador of the USA, the ambassador of Egypt, and other foreign dignitaries, as well as the Lebanese parliament at the time, and mostly wealthy Lebanese families. But with the onset of the civil war, this whole plan of the future of suburbia and lavish lifestyle in Dawhat Alamoun kind of died with the beginning of the civil war. And then we have a new phase that the utopic planning of suburban dream was halted, and we'll see a new thing emerging in the area. This is an area view of as the area was suburbanizing at the time before the civil war. And so during the civil war in Lebanon brought with it an occupation by the Syrian army for the suburbs of Beirut. And the Syrian army actually used many of these villas as a location for them to, like they use them as military nodes in the suburban areas to control everything that's happening in the suburbs. So you'll see here one of the walls inside one of the villas with graffiti from the Syrian. It reads Surya al-Assad. So Syrian armed forces occupation of strategic area in around Beirut confiscated mostly these villas and buildings to establish the military stations. And these locations acted as nodes in a flow of information, military weapons, control systems. And Villa Kahal, the villa that I'm talking about, was actually occupied by the Syrian armed forces until 2005, until the Syrian armed forces left. So this is a prototype of the Villa Kahal. This is not Villa Kahal, but this is a prototype of the villas that were built by the US model. And you can see that they were mostly taken and all these military graffiti inside of them by military forces. And the urbanization of the Syrian armed forces also brought with complete control of the urban development of the area, where Syrian armed forces played a key role in urbanization. They became the de facto rulers on the ground, and they condoned extra-rural construction in exchange for money, for apartments, for power. And this created a frenzy pace of urbanization, and it became the area that was planned for a low-rise, villa, lavish. It became like a high-rise, mostly informal, and actually it affected the airport to the extent that the airport had to build a new runway to avoid going next to Dawhat Alamoun because of these tall villas that were not supposed to be there. And from the occupation to the refugeeness. So after the beginning of the Syrian war in 2011, millions upon millions of Syrian refugees came into Lebanon, crossed the border to Lebanon, and at some point, and it's more probably right now, but at some point it became that for every 4 Lebanese, there's one, or for every 3 Lebanese, for every 4 Lebanese, there's 1 Syrian refugee. So the refugee population became about 25% of the Lebanese population. It's estimated now to be about 30% of the Lebanese population. So you can see if it's a very large part of the local population is now Syrian refugees. And so many of the refugees came, and because of the country, as I said, refused to build refugee camps, which is what the UNHCR and other UN agencies used for, they had to find housing in just the urban areas. One place is Dawhat Alamoun. So this is 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and some of the numbers have declined since, but not in proportion to the Lebanese. As I said, the proportion to Lebanese increased, and 28 families eventually settled in the ex-Villa Mkahal, an average of 5 people per family, and they came from all over Syria. And I managed to take a picture of one of these units by Yasser, and she used it by herself. And this is just one room. I tried to take a picture that shows how the bathroom next to the kitchen, next to the bedroom, and it's just like a 2.5 by 2.5 meter room where this is the refugee unit where most of the people were living. She was living with one son. Some units were bigger. It depends on how much power you were able to take and how much concrete blocks and wood you were able to gather to be able to build shelter inside that villa. So while refugees took refuge in urban areas, a new and formal gradual geography of refugee settlements started emerging in what used to be spaces of occupation. They came from all over Syria, and then their settlement, basically, in this case, in the case of Mkahal, it was facilitated by the mosque manager next door, who's a housing developer, and they ended up buying Villa Mkahal after the Syrian occupation left the villa. And families actually said they don't pay rent. And I started becoming curious about like why didn't they pay rent? Like, why is this guy allowing the 28 families to live in this villa? So I started asking around. So families said the villa owner is also a mosque founder, settled them there rent-free, and the villa is managed by this Hajj. Hajj is a person who went to Mecca, and he's usually a religious figure. And he basically also provided them with money and building material and electricity and water, and helped them construct their shelters inside the villa. And so when I asked Ahmed, one of the refugees from Homs, about how did he manage to get a shelter inside his villa, he said the Hajj, and I quote, told us that he sheltered us here as a retaliation against the Syrian armed forces that had confiscated his villa for two decades against his will, during an interview I conducted in 2018, hinting that the refugees actually were anti-Syrian regime that are sympathetic to the Syrian opposition at the time, and that aligned with the mosque, the politics of the mosque guy. And actually, when I met the Hajj himself, I asked him why did he agree to settle all these refugees in his villa, the villa that he bought. He said, why didn't you develop? And I asked, why didn't you develop the land into an apartment building, for example, like the rest of Dawhat Aramoun, and especially that he's a real estate developer. And he said, and I quote, not everything is about life and transactions. Some transactions need to be done with God, he said. Meanwhile, the refugees were not able to articulate in future in Beirut, and they spoke of the past in Syria. So basically, he moved me from a material discussion to a metaphysical, religious discussion about why he actually, and I couldn't get the real answer of why he settled these refugees in the villa. Meanwhile, you can see the for sale signs here. Many of the neighbors of the Villa Mkahal did not want to overlook, because of the xenophobia that has been festering in Lebanon against the Syrian refugees. Did not want to look over a villa that has Syrian refugees. So you see here, I don't know how much you can see, but most windows have the shutters down, and apartments have for sale signs. And this is a picture that I took from the one of the refugee units to the surrounding neighborhood. However, when I went last month there, just to continue with this sedimentary urbanization method, to see what happened after like several years, like I've been going every year or two since I started intensively working there. And then this is what I found, that actually the villa has been destroyed and the families have been evicted, and with no one to ask what happened to them. So this is a new kind of evicted, a new future of that is being built on a dead future that the refugees have imagined for themselves in the area. So the next project I will talk about, which is close by to the next site I will talk about, which is next to Villa Mkahal, is the Zahra project, and it's a completely different type of housing accommodation. So the second modality involves an adjacent, notorious, large-scale, low-cost residential project that I'm calling the Zahra project. Zahra is inhabited by a mix of poor Lebanese families without property titles. So this is basically an informal vertical squatter settlement, and more than 200 Syrian refugee families who can only afford to rent there because of the apartment's informal status. And I'll tell you in a second why. A low-cost, rundown, unfinished urban development. Through Zahra, I examined basically the following processes: the building of Beirut as a global city at some point before the financial crisis, the gentrification that happened, capitalism's debris, informality, urban refugeeness, and the logic of international aid, and the future of greening. And therefore, the Zahra project basically is notorious for the heaps of garbage. And I just went again, as I said, in January, winter break for this research, and the garbage continues to pile there in the alleyways. There are clogged sanitation pipes and the myriad of skin diseases that plague its children. In Zahra, daily life is shaped by itineraries of displacement, an international conflict in Syria, pre-war transnational migrant networks, Palestinian refugees who can't access housing anywhere else, the mandate of international refugee aid organizations who are looking for urban refugees everywhere to scrambling to find the nature of their work, and the refugee population that predominantly is living in mixed urbanized areas. While the Lebanese children go schools in the town's public school, most of the Syrian children, many of whom did not manage to be registered by the UNHCR, are not in schools, spending most of their days playing in Zahra's garbage-filled open spaces. So you can see the two of the kids that at the time I was trying, I was talking to their parents, and so the wall that you see on that side is a sewage wall. It's green and it's all sewage, and this is where the children are playing every day. Many of them have diseases. Many of them even access any kind of healthcare except a doctor that comes every few weeks to check, like just charity, basically. So why did Zahra end up being the refuge for Syrian refugees in this way? It's the first layer that I look at is how the post-war Beirut and the imagining of Beirut as a global city, or the making of Beirut as a global city. In 1990, Zahra, like many other similar projects, provided a utopia of suburban living for those families who were being gentrified from Beirut. As post-war reconstruction project of the city aimed to make Beirut a global city. Like you see here, this is a Four Seasons Hotel and like many of the hotels in downtown Beirut. Middle-income families were sold dream apartments in green areas with trees and birds like Dawhat Aramoun and projects like Zahra, only to realize later that these promises failed as many developers actually defaulted on their payments and therefore were not able to provide apartments or title deeds most of the time. Many families found themselves living basically in vertical informal settlements. These became debris of capitalism, basically many of the, just to show you, so many of the families were gentrified from the downtown of Beirut to the areas in southeast the city, the Aramoun, and some of the area that I'm talking about. And so they became basically victims of the debris of capitalism. The gentrification from Beirut towards peripheries like Dawhat Aramoun happened after the civil war, but there was no regulation about who are the developers, where did they get the money. As I said, the Syrian armed forces were in total control of what's happening. And the aim was to produce Dawhat Aramoun, for those of you interested or know about the sectarian geography of Beirut, and I can talk more about it in the Q&A, as a Sunni periphery, a destination for those who are being gentrified, Sunni families that are being gentrified from Beirut towards the peripheries, in the making of the Beirut as a global city. So large-scale affordable housing developments mushroomed in the area, and by basically developer landowners agreements. And Dawhat Aramoun became this patchwork of expensive villas and low-cost developments like Zahra, and the promised future of an apartment in the suburb with view of the Mediterranean Sea and surrounded by trees started gradually fading. As you can see here, for example, I tried to show you by this line drawn that there are two missing buildings of the project, and many of the people who bought apartments, and they still do that in Beirut, they pay up, the developers ask them for money before they actually build the apartment. So many people have paid for their apartments before the building was built. And so they came to look for the apartments, and many of them did not find the apartment. It was just like in the air. And so they started scrambling upper squats first to make sure at least they get a shelter or they get a housing with the money they paid. And eventually there's like about 400 lawsuits going on in the Zahra project, and it's became an informal area. This utopia of living basically ended up by it became like a big scandal, as the landowner basically killed one of the developers as they tried to scramble to figure out what to do with this project. And they didn't stop. The developers still continued to develop other projects, but Zahra became a squatter site. Because Zahra is informal, it basically became cheaper than other places to live in and became a destination for Syrian refugees. And refugees started renting in this project. More than 200 families live in the area. People say around 500 between adults and children. 500 Syrian people live in Zahra alone. And again, most of them don't go to school. Most of the kids don't go to school. And Lebanese started renting out at some point to Syrians and moving to better living conditions. And renting space was actually very comparable to places in some ways, like to the city. Sometimes the rent, there was so much demand for refugees to rent in these places that don't have rent titles because it was available for them. That rent was about $250, $300, and it's still at that level, which is after the financial crisis in Lebanon is actually a large sum of money. And others who cannot other Lebanese families who were not able to afford to leave, were actually stuck in that they felt that they were stuck in this situation there. And I asked one of Manal, one of the residents in the area, about how she felt
being as a Lebanese person married to a Palestinian refugee, about how she felt living in Zahra, and she said, and I quote, "In such living conditions, we are more refugees than the Syrian refugees," which started creating a lot of hostilities between the Lebanese hosts and the Lebanese families and the Syrian families in the area. So you can see, I don't see lighting it, but this is like, it's mostly apartments that are crumbling, garbage, sewage that are stagnant, all sites of diseases, and these are the walls. It's black mold everywhere, and these are the living conditions under both, which all the refugees and the Lebanese families are living under. What I found also specifically interesting is the role that international aid organizations played into this geography. So in 2015, because of all the sewage and the problem with the garbage, the local residents started lobbying the United Nations Higher Council for Refugees, along with other international aid organizations, to update the project's water and sanitation infrastructure and improve the living conditions for its Syrian refugees and Lebanese hosts. And these interventions would also benefit the poor Lebanese residents of the area. And therefore, the UNHCR had to experiment, because this is not something that they're used to, about how to intervene in pipes, what I call the pipes of international development, how to put pipes on an existing project, not in a refugee camp, and that connects and zigzags between Syrian refugees and Lebanese families. And so the pipes of international refugee aid installed 3 years prior started crumbling. And the caveat is, although they came and the UNHCR came and tried to install the sewage system, what happened is, why did it crumble? And that's because of the temporality of how UN agencies think, or all international agencies think. So the way they think is that their mandate is temporary until the refugees go back, right? This is UNHCR. And therefore, they decided that what's good for these buildings, because the refugees are only going to stay, according to them, like 2-3 years, to put pipes that are just like 5 centimeters, sewage pipes for all these buildings that are 10th floor high. And so they installed like the smallest pipes and the cheaper pipes, because they thought this is a temporary settlement and eventually this is going to be resolved. Of course, we know, anyone who studies refugees rarely go back, and camps rarely resolve, and usually refugees just stay in the places where after they cross borders all over the world, not only in the Middle East. And therefore, all these pipes and the money they paid for these pipes crumbled within just 2 years. And because they needed a larger kind of pipes and a more durable intervention. And so eventually the refugees had to come together, although they didn't have barely any money, they had to come together and install a different system, a parallel system of pipes that was bigger, and to try to actually be able to survive in these shelters. And so they started accumulating like $10 here, $10 there, to be able to rebuild, and they used their own labor to rebuild the piping system. Again, in 2024, in January, when I went to visit, the system has crumbled again, because this has been going on for 6-7 years, and so they needed yet a new pipe system, and no one has the money to update the system. So again, to repeat that, because for the UNHCR, the imagined timeline of refugees was that of 2-3 years, after which the refugees would return home, which, as I said, never happens. And so my research so far shows how aid organizations' interventions have become contested between international and local jurisdiction, rendering these interventions ineffective and left to decay without maintenance, further contributing to environmental crises that people have to endure on a daily basis. In addition, the pipes that were installed by aid organization in Zahra that were only meant to manage a certain amount of waste that did not endure the length of time that the refugees have been staying there. So the pipes are clogged again. So I'll move right now from these questions about urban refugees and Lebanon, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that, to link it to what's happening in Gaza and the question of refugeeness there. So when thinking about these questions about international aid and how do international aid organizations intervene in a refugee crisis, of course, sometimes like in the book For the War Yet to Come, the reason it was powerful for me to think about the yet to of a future of crisis in Beirut was because of, like, Beirut is an extreme case of conflict. Similarly, Gaza is the extreme case of refugeeness, where about 80% or 90% of the people live there are actually urban refugees.
And therefore, if you want to think about the question of refugeeness and shelter and international aid organization, that is your extreme case study to think about that. And so when thinking about these questions of what Paulson describes as humanitarian urbanism, it's important to learn and theorize with the most extreme cases of humanitarian urbanism and of urban refugeeness, which is Gaza, particularly Gaza city in Palestine. And so Gaza basically was created as a separate territory after 1948, majorly composed of refugees from other parts of Palestine, and it was under the control of Egypt until 1956, and then it came under the Israeli occupation until 2005. Refugee camps in Gaza were initially established to again, the temporary comes up again, but it has been like since 1948, house thousands of refugees of Palestinians who lost their homes and livelihoods during the Arab-Israeli war in 1948. Nearly 75 years later, they are home to many of the territory's 1.7 million refugees, and they before October 7, and they rely on humanitarian aid basically to survive. In 1994, after the Oslo Accord, the Israeli army withdrew from Gaza and built a side separation fence. They also built a few settlements that were evacuated in 2005 when Gaza was sieged by Israel, and as per one Israeli official said, let them all perish in there. And in 2007, when Hamas won the elections in Gaza, the Israel also blockaded the entire Gaza Strip, also from the sea and the air and from underwater. This is some images from the United Nations UNRWA about the Gaza blockade. I'm sure some of you have become familiar with these images about Gaza. And so we speak about Gaza, we can think about Gaza's de-development rather than development, and as it relates to pipes of international refugee aid. So Gaza's area is about 45 square kilometers, like 141 square miles, and it became the subject of what we could call economic de-development, a permanent humanitarian case for other actors, but not for Israel. So it basically survives on humanitarian aid. The building is by humanitarian aid, the infrastructure is by humanitarian aid, which continue to build while Israel just trying to blockade the area. Gazans were not subject of the Israeli state, but were also incapable of forming their own state. And they were cast basically as bare lives, whose death or survival are of no consequences. And Israel's only responsibility in Gaza then became its authority to take life or keep life at bare minimum. And I talked about that in a second, which basically enter humanitarian aid, which is you keep a population barely surviving by just making sure that you allow a little bit of humanitarian aid to enter. According to UNRWA, 1.5 million registered refugees out of 1.9 million total population of Gaza, and so basically 1.4 out of 1.9 are refugees, which creates these ideas of thresholds of humanitarian emergency. And so within the idea of Gaza as a site of extreme refugeeness, and the fact that it relies on humanitarian aid, we can think of this what scholars have called the thresholds of humanitarian emergency. With Israel's siege on Gaza, Gaza became the area in which Israel can basically create famine if they want, which is watching right now on our screens as I speak, but chooses not to sometimes, but sometimes they choose to mobilize the starvation. Documents released by the Israeli defense minister show formulas for calculating the amount of commodities allowed into the strip, setting a lower line for when averages are expected. So basically, but also ignoring that warning, and an upper line above which even basic humanitarian items were blocked. So basically, the threshold allows a certain amount of material, cement, chocolate, whatever it is, that allows for survival, but then nothing above it, and try to maintain the bare minimum. And this is the threshold of humanitarian aid. Same applies for cement, for piping. This creates the internalization of human suffering, spreading suffering while also minimizing of the people killed. For those of you who are familiar with these concepts of per life, you can use that to think about how then you create this population that whether their death or their survival is of no consequence, but you don't want them to die on your watch. So basically, you keep the bare minimum, the care minimum there to keep them alive. So this brings it back to the question of normalization planning within emergency. So in this context of emergency, planning has been normalized, and the politics of intermittent suffering become clear in planning applications. While in Israel, building plans, for example, must include a safe room in the case of war. We all heard about it after the attacks of October 7. Gaza's plans actually do not have don't have any consideration for surviving wars. There are no safe rooms. There are no areas that you can run to, which we're seeing because people just have to evacuate their houses, and it's overcrowded. So overall, institutions in Gaza do not plan or build bomb shelters, and it becomes a part of the humanitarian aid agencies to become these areas of refuges for Gaza. Also, you start having like when it's similar in Lebanon, but in which you have religious political organizations, in this case Hamas, that are militarized, become the de facto urban planners on the ground. So Hamas became also trying to normalize planning within emergency by supporting the building, for example, of these malls. This is the Andalusia Mall, but at the same time, this mall was destroyed recently, and so it became also even these like gestures of normalization have been destroyed during the past 4 months. Meanwhile, UNRWA, the UN agency, so in Lebanon, we were speaking about the UNHCR, which is the global UN aid agency. In Palestine, for Palestinians, there's a specific agency that was created, the UNRWA. And so the UNRWA tries to design projects with cutting-edge innovations in planning or in community development, like creating community centers, AI centers, GIS centers, trying to like also normalize planning within a state of emergency. While mentally interesting, most of UNRWA's developments end up actually becoming temporary dwellings for displaced persons, which we're seeing happening. So the Israeli military basically targets mundane civilian infrastructure, the local justice system, and recreational spaces in Gaza. Whatever is built will be destroyed. Gaza people will have to flee to the UN buildings that are at least safe spaces until they weren't recently, and until they bombed. And most of these structures actually have been destroyed. So 26 hospitals have been destroyed so far. So the highly normal urban planning policies in Gaza City crash with the reality of urbicide that is characteristics of life in this strip. And so what ends up happening is humanitarian urbanism becomes the site of refugeeness. This is like UN shelters became sites of refugees. And the urban refugees they move from urban refugees in Gaza, they move to camps, and then they go back to urban refugees. And the way it links back to Lebanon is to think about the future of these spaces, or the re-inhabiting of these dead futures. So what happens to these buildings after when right now Rafah is being destroyed? How are they going to be inhabited? And then we can learn from Beirut about what's going to happen, about Villa Mkahal and how that destroyed building has been inhabited. Or, for example, in my previous work from Maram Khayel, how the destroyed buildings in the Civil War were inhabited. You can see the more recent cement blocks where people built homes inside the destroyed buildings to be able to make shelter in otherwise destroyed buildings. This is a clearer picture of some of these buildings that still dot the geography of Beirut. So basically, so in the case of Beirut, while providing basic shelter for many, these spaces of poverty have become contested terrains, not only along sectarian lines, but most importantly along national lines, fueling xenophobia toward refugees, channeled through discourses not only around national and urban citizenship, but is articulated over the material of these spaces, over garbage disposal, broken pipes, and overflowing sewage. While the Syrian refugees in Beirut are unable to imagine their futures as the war in Syria continues to rage, the Lebanese families still dream one day of the greening project of imagining the returning of birds and trees and the departures of the refugees, especially, and of course, there's a lot of violence against the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So my sedimentary urbanization concept and this project therefore excavates the intertwined histories and geographies of housing markets, the making of the global city, gentrification, suburbanization, informality, with militarization, occupation, wars, and displacement that have shaped these peripheries. It shows, for example, how the Zahra housing project, which is prototypical of housing arrangements for refugees in metropolitan Beirut, is governed by honeycomb of international, national, and local jurisdictions with their overlapping interventions that shape the everyday life of conflict on the microscopic level of the housing project. So you start seeing what's interesting about that is, so while we think about aid organizations and like global funding and cut-off funding, what's interesting in doing these kind of projects is that you actually see how these global discourses end up coming down to a pipe or a connection or sewage or garbage pickup, etc. Like how all these discourses and money comes down to the everyday life of people. So the research also provides insights on the materiality, not only on the materiality, but also on the temporality of urban infrastructure as the infrastructure emerges as signs of contestation. So as the destruction, and the insights basically is about the life for urban refugees years after displacement. So in the case of Syrian refugees since 2011, in the case of Gaza since October, after displacement, as they struggle their existence between humanitarian rights and claims to a decent life through urban citizenship in their new settlements. And so as the destruction of Gaza Strip continues, and as these slimmers of hope for new geographies of dead futures are destroyed, the question becomes, is it about the geographies of dead futures that I'm thinking about, or is it about the future of geographies of the dead that are the situation in Gaza? And this question becomes more pertinent as we witness the state of Israel drawing one plan after another, urban plan, for those interested in master plans, about what Gaza could be from their ethno-nationalist point of view. So so I'm going to show you some of these projects that some of you might have seen on social media, which was, for example, this was one of the first things that showed Gaza, the possibility for Gaza, or if you're watching Hulu, for example, if you watch Hulu, some of these ads come right now of what Gaza could be like a destination for tourism. So this is one of the first artificial intelligence, I'm imagining it's an AI generated project about, look what Gaza could have become if it wasn't for refugees and Hamas living there. And it was a big debate. It's basically a Disneyfication of conflict and Disneyfication of suffering, but also it becomes into more serious, more concrete Imagine program. So this is one of the ads for a real estate company, Harissa Haf, that says the settlement development enterprise is advertising that its vision for the Gaza, which is a house on the beach, is not a dream. We have begun cleaning rubber and funding of squatters. The developers said eventually that it was a joke for their to entertain their followers on social media, that they didn't like really think about it. So the Haaretz that published, no, an Israeli real estate company is not selling beachfront homes in Gaza. But one has, in these kind of things, you cannot separate what's being imagined or how people imagine the other or construct the other as you want to get rid of them from actually what happens in the ground. But then you also come to the actual concrete state-sponsored developments. So I was tracing this vision that Israel wants to an artificial island in front of Gaza. So this made the news a few weeks back. The foreign minister presents idea for artificial island of Gaza in a new meeting when they hosted Israel to figure out the future of Gaza. But this is not, this idea came up, so this is 2024. This was thought about 2011 when Israel thought that they might want to build artificial island of Gaza Strip as part of their blockade. But then in 2016, they actually wanted international organizations to help fund $5 billion to build the artificial island with them. And then this same vision dies in certain ways. This is the dead vision of a master plan, and then reemerges in a new way, where right now, in 2024, the same artificial island is suggested by Israel to house all the refugees that they're going to move from Gaza to this artificial island, and then so that they can rebuild a vision for Gaza that is different. I'm going to try to show you a video of that imagined island, and then we'll take it from there.
For the Gaza Strip, and Israel's transport and intelligence has come up with a grand plan that he is convinced can help Gaza, the Palestinian territory on the Mediterranean, stand on its own 2 feet. I'm Luke Baker, the bureau chief of Reuters in Jerusalem.
Construction of an artificial island with a
Intelligence Minister Israel Katz has been promoting this big Gaza artificial island scheme for a number of months, but now he's released a dynamic video trying to convince people of his scheme. What it would do is create an artificial island about 3 miles off the coast of Gaza, connect the mainland by a causeway, and on the island there would be all the infrastructure Gaza needs to stand on its own 2 feet. Gas, electricity facilities, port, terminal, cargo, a desalination plant, even potentially in the future, an airport. He says take about 5 years to build and require an investment from the international community of about $5 billion. The main aim of this scheme, as well as to try and reduce the humanitarian economic situation Gaza's 2 million people are living in, is to remove the impression amongst many in the world that Israel is responsible for Gaza's deteriorating economic conditions.
In order to ensure that security threats are addressed,
However, Israel isn't going to pay for it itself. It wants the international community to stump up the money, and it will retain security control for the waters around the island, allowing a national policing force to maintain security on the island and to monitor checkpoints along the causeway. Well, it's got some backing from Israel's cabinet. The defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, is ultimately responsible for Gaza. So far, he isn't supporting the idea.
So this video was developed in 2016, was repurposed in right now in the wake of a genocide to advocate for this artificial island, to become the site to move all the refugees, all the people of Gaza to this artificial island, and change only one thing of instead of connecting it to mainland Gaza, to connect it through a bridge to India, so that there's no connection to Gaza, to build a tunnel and a bridge to the Indian continent. And so, as Anu Siddiqui is arguing in her study of the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, she argues that studying with the contested architecture of territory as an object whose story extends over a much longer period than expected produces historiographical methods that may probably disrupt expected chronologies, regimes of historicity, geographies, and other analytics. But when we see these things, the question remains, under regimes of violence, under regimes of war, under non-ending wars, under futures of wars and conflicts, under settler colonialism, under a global threat of World War III. So it's what future and rooted in what past and for whom. Thank you.
Do you want to take your own?
Yeah, I take questions. Yeah.
Can I ask it in Arabic and then English, whatever?
Whatever you want, yeah.
Okay. I'll ask you both, but I would prefer to ask in Arabic for you, inshallah. Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا للمحاضرة صراحة يعني touch.
You want me to translate it, or you just
Well, I tried to make myself was really affected to my family and everyone there. تقدير يعني غزة أو العراق أو لبنان راح يكون الوضع أحسن. تقديرنا أنه أكو للمشاريع هاي جدوى ولا بس يعني ريسيرش بس فقط انه بحث او يعني صراحه الشيء حلو يعني انه الواحد يلتمس اكو مواضيع من امريكا او من دول باقيه بس بجد اكو نسبه انه هاي المشاريع تتحقق. I will ask.
I can summarize it. So he's asking like, is it possible for any of these kinds of a planning vision that is more equitable or just to happen in the Middle East region? And I'm glad that I'm just a researcher. I was a practitioner at some point, but I mean, I think we are. So I would take a line from the Black feminist geographers who were related to the situation with Black geography and the history of slavery and Jim Crow. And they say that basically, if you can't imagine or if you can't dream, there's no room for liberation. And I've always lived by that I do research on this, I critique it, but I also, in some ways, part of me, while looking at dystopian geographies, is still hopeful that one day we can actually live a different kind of life. I grew up in Lebanon. I'm a refugee myself. I'm more displaced myself. I experienced war myself, and my son and I were displaced 6 times before, and now I'm going to talk about this here. So I don't know what it means. I see my family is in Lebanon. They still have a bag on the side when the war to happen. You know, right now, Lebanon, South Lebanon is part of the war. And so I don't know what my answer to. Like, I'm actually getting emotional because, I mean, I lived my life hoping that that child who was a refugee will not have to do that again, but I see it happening all the time. But again, if we don't imagine better, we cannot break ourselves. Sorry, I don't have it more particular. Yeah.
Again, thank you so much for your research and for the engagement that you had with those families. As someone who's like just exposed to this research for the first time in some of these terms, it seems like so much of the past envisioning was that a future could be imagined through capitalism, and then capitalism failed, and then now they're building upon that dead future, but with more capitalism. And so what discussions are kind of happening to that like imagines nation building beyond the mechanisms of capitalism, of like building islands or building suburbs?
So in Lebanon, it's just capitalism. It's private. I mean, it's interesting because people, when they study Lebanon, they don't know how to describe the state. Some argue that there is no state, there is no government. Some argue that there are like political parties are governments within government. For my work, I think of the government like these religious political organizations, militias, formal militias, whatever you want to call them, political parties. They're both outside the state. They have their vision, mostly capitalist, but intersect with their sectarian interests, and they also constitute that state. So it's very hard to do anything that's not them, and it's not their vision. They're not capitalist, sectarian vision. And so Lebanon right now, I work with several, like, I don't know if these are hopeful because they're small scale, but I work with a lot of community, like civil society, community groups that are thinking differently of urban planning. So rather than just thinking that urban planning is about these big visions that require so much money and power, etc., how can you rethink planning in which you sit together with people who you've constructed as an other, whether socioeconomically like poorer or wealthier or religiously different? How you can think about the shared environment. Like, okay, we're gonna have to live with, we have to figure out garbage, we're gonna have to figure out trees, we're gonna have to figure pollution out, water. Is there a way you can use urban planning as a tool in which you can communicate and think with the other rather than like just build these futures that are not gonna happen and they're just gonna die because someone else will be in power or another war will happen. But there are these small scale like urban activists in Beirut that many of us were trying to find, think differently about, not only about Beirut and urban planning as a field, like, because as I said, while I'm working on Beirut, and many people here will think, oh my God, I never, this is never my reality, thanks goodness. I'm gonna be very, the whole talk is political. I'm gonna be very political. The reason it's not people's realities here, the reason is because you guys are far removed, people who are lived here, far removed from wars that are being funded by us. I'm now in America, so I can say us. I feel bad because I feel like I'm killing my own people. But so the reason, there are wars that are fought on our behalf in the name of our safety, but we don't get touched by them because they're very far geographically from them. So so while we think our future is you just get an education and get a job and you're gonna go into the American dream, this idea of progress and non-ending progress where you exploit resources and exploit land and exploit air and water is not sustainable, whether you are in the US or somewhere else. And so I feel like the whole urban planning field and community organizing field needs to be rethought to stop this idea of just accumulation and we just have to things we're going to improve, which just exploit more resources and more labor and think differently. Okay. I think if you didn't ask about anything, I'm just going to ask about things you're
I think, thank you. I think you've presented a lot of really amazing information. I also think it was a really broad coverage of a lot of different topics that they're not really being thrown all together in the same pot. And I think in the beginning of your lecture, talking about urbanism and the future of urbanism and your identification that there is no such thing as a temporary settlement, I think really astute, really one way to begin thinking about urban problems and urbanism and inequality of wealth. I do think that by the time we get to the end of the lecture, we're almost getting into some political sensationalism that almost obscures the points you're making at the beginning of the lecture. Like, if we were to go back to Lebanon, my first question is, for any kind of consistent or any kind of effective solutions to be made for the impoverished, okay? Is there the kind of stability, political stability possible in Lebanon for anything to gain any traction, for any decisions to allow something to continue to be solved? Or is that the first problem?
What kind of stability are you looking for?
Well, what I'm thinking is, and I guess the comparison that comes to mind for me is, the comparison that comes to mind to me is the problem of poverty in Brazil, which is, you know, also incredibly bad and all kinds of horrible conditions. But the one thing that is kind of accepted, or at least in some places has been tackled, is the idea of not considering this to be a temporary thing. We have this slum condition, we have this favela, we have this, and how to allow people to begin to gain equity, to actually have an investment or have ownership in a place, knowing that they are not temporary there. That's like step one. That's bedrock. It makes me wonder if that bottom step is at all possible in Lebanon before you can even begin talking about it.
So the question, there's a lot of ways which one can speak to what you're talking about. In terms of stability, if you're looking for stability, a country like Lebanon, it's not, I mean, all countries, including this country, it's not isolated from what's going on globally. And a country as small as Lebanon, as poor as Lebanon, there's so many international forces that stability, they are the people who decide whether it's going to be stable or not. They are going to be the entities that decide if the war is going to happen or not. It's not the people in Lebanon that do that. So this is from different, but if I want to answer from more an urbanization answer to your question, I mean, property and the idea of property is at the bottom line of the question of whether something is temporary or not. And most of these people that you see in the refugees that are in the buildings are able to sit there because there are no property titles, actually, that no one was able to get a property title. So that's the only way that they were able to live in the cracks of the capitalist, the cracks of the property regime, to live in that. And I know you thought, I don't expect everyone in an auditorium to be on board with me thinking about Lebanon and Israel in the way I spoke about it, which you characterized as sensationalist. But there's no way in my conscientious to speak on a teaching week on Palestine without bringing the question of refugeeness and property and stability to the question of Gaza, and because Gaza is under siege, this is something that we have to speak with. But I don't expect several people to agree on that, and I expect that. But what you're asking about is a political question, and that's an urban question. But keeping people stable under the atmosphere is about getting their property. What I'm arguing here is this is possible for them to take refuge because there is no property. And that would require thinking more about how can we think of the different regimes of settlement or living together that are not based on perpetuating me and my individual property and thinking more from that. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, like, when you went to the big communities in Lebanon, how did you make, like, I assume that there was maybe some wariness of you for spending there, you know, how do you make those communities feel comfortable enough to the point where you can photograph their homes and talk to them and tell their stories?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very great question. So any work in this kind of contested area is very difficult. And it's both ways. Like in my first book, I can talk more about how you have to be giving like it cannot be, and no research should be extractive. There's always should be some sort of like, you're helping out in some way, you're providing some information in some way. So in this case, they were interested in like, these are people on the margins of the city in some leftover spaces that nobody is asking about. So in one way, they were like, take a picture, take photos, because we want other people to see. Because I was also going to UNHCR, I was also going to CHF, the Norwegian, and showing them videos, because I was trying to lobby for garbage pickup and for pipes and stuff, because I felt like I would be complicit in this, if I see all of this and the children who are sick and not do anything about it. So I was actually taking videos and going to UNHCR and lobbying. I was able to get UNICEF, which is the UN agency for children, to come over and try to help some children. And then the pandemic happened. And so I was, through UNICEF, got masks and, you know, the things that we're doing during the COVID. So I was able to get UNICEF to see the videos and found the other agencies did not really care. And so it wasn't that why they like take pictures and tell them we need help, take pictures and the people who were, and then there's Lebanese people, take pictures and tell them we are the poor here, they're getting like UN, they're taking the $50, we are the ones who don't have any money, take pictures and tell them what the Syrians doing for us. So each one of them is telling you to take pictures because of something that they want you to show to the world, you know, and I was trying to do as much as possible. Again, when the financial crisis happened, I was taking food boxes. So you don't know what to do as a researcher, because again, back to this question, I can't build, I can't get funding for food or something, funding for pipes, but you know, you feel so, in this kind of research projects, you feel like unable to do anything. You really feel like small compared to the question. But this is how I do things. This is how exactly people were saying, please show this to the world. Yes.
Just what I'm hearing is that there wasn't a time where you were turned away, like there was a need, so people were asking for your direct help. So there was like refusal in the process, like people were asking for the support.
Yes.
You were directly responding to the direct thing they needed.
Yes, and I actually taught at some point, because they were like, can you teach us alphabet? Because the children don't even know. So what's so sad about that is that the parents, because they were in Syria, actually got education, so they can all read and write. And in Syria, they had a very good education system before. Irrespective of the regime, they had good public education. So many people were able to. So actually the grandparents and the parents can read and write. All the children, about 200 children, they don't even know the alphabet. So at some point, like I was like, what am I doing? You know, let me just go teach these kids the alphabet. And so I did that, and I even did it this January, you know, just to write their names. I don't know if it's gonna go, it's not gonna lead to much, but like small things like that. Yeah, they were asking for it. Like, can you teach us? Can you teach us? The kids are running after me in the, like, are you teach us how to write our names? So something as basic as that. And I was thinking recently, I was like, do I need to put this project on hold and just like gather people from here, like people who I know, and let's just go teach, you know, for the summer. I don't know, like something else other than just presenting the research in like academic hallways. Yeah, before that.
Ways do you think that like international agencies can be improved? It sounds like quite often they kind of come in, do something, and it kind of makes it worse in some ways.
I mean, it's a complicated answer, and I don't necessarily know. I'm sure some people are more knowledgeable about me, about the workings of the UN agencies. I more study them about how they, like from the ground up, like how they implement their projects on the ground. But from my research, my interaction with them, I mean, some people are benefiting from the $50, and they benefited for a few months from the pipes, and they benefit from the doors and the curtains and the sinks. But the problem is that first, the money that goes to the UN is very much dependent on the countries that put money into the UN. So at any moment, like they can say, like right now, we're not going to give UNRWA any more money, and the money will dry up. Or we're not going to give UN. For example, at some point in Lebanon, this is another important point, that you move from questions of humanitarian aid to questions of development. Like after a few years of being a refugee, there will be no more money because it's moving to another country in the world. They're having refugee crisis. And then it becomes a question of who can put money in development. And then the money dries out. And so as much as they try, of course, there's overhead and the directors are being paid so much money, so eventually only 20% of the money that they get gets to the people. That's a bigger issue. But also there's the global politics of humanitarian aid that is very much dependent on the global north, on the Western countries' money and therefore power.
I have two questions. First, I wonder if you could share a little bit about how your research speaks to debates about informality. It seems like thinking about informality as sort of these a field of contestation in which flexibility is mobilized to particular ends, but to benefit some groups at the expense of other groups. But in this case, informality was a really important resource for these refugees. So I'm curious about that. And then I'm also curious if you have reflections on why sort of development experts have such a hard time seeing the sort of the permanentness of refugees. It's kind of like the opposite almost of Ornia Paschal when he's talking about permanent temporariness, or like the status of poor people. I'm thinking about street vendors in my research is kept forever temporary to sort of foreclose taking a stand on their right to the city. But in this case, it's almost like it's related but kind of different because it's kind of the inability to wrestle with the permanency of refugees.
Yeah, this is it. These are great points. I mean, and I feel like that in some ways, it's very hard to think about the question of informality because we're used to it, to think about it when there's a state and whether you're like legalized by the state or not legalized by the state. And therefore, there is a relationship between what's the state, what like the rules and regulations and what's outside it. When you're thinking about international aid agencies, I feel I'm still grappling with it. It's just very hard to then think about the question of informality because it's informal with respect to, for example, the local government. But the mandate of the global, the international aid organization is very different. They don't care if there is a title deed for where you're living or not. It's not. It doesn't affect whether you're going to get your pipe or not, because for them the mandate is that if you're a refugee and you have a refugee card, we need to support you. And so it's interesting to me because what I call this honeycomb of restrictions, when they come down to like questions of infrastructure or property, etc., it becomes very hard then to characterize the binary of informal, informal, host, refugee. Everything gets like blended together. And so this is my second question. So I don't have a clear answer about what does it say when we go further even from the government to think about question of informality, but the question that I answered about the property there has been very interesting to me because of lack of formality, because of the lack of formal titles that people are able to have shelter, and this has been interesting to me. So because usually you're more secure if you have your title in the future, but here you're more secure as a refugee if there is no security of title, and therefore it flips it, but I don't know what it says yet. I go to the other question. Yeah.
If I can ask too, yes, we are removed, but we are complicit in funding these wars. But in a way, we're also not removed from the debris of capitalism that's described. I mean, if you just like take Central.
I just walked. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, it's kind of horrifying to see the spectrum of, sure, like the spectrum of how bad it is a thing, but the fact that those spectrums exist structurally and repeatedly, like across the globe, is really wild. And I'm wondering to what extent does international aid, like on our part, matter when it's kind of like figure out your stuff first before you try and help someone else, even though we also are part of the reason.
Yeah, this is a big question. It's hard. And I was walking. I came here yesterday, and I live in New York. The homelessness problem is, or the homelessness question, quote unquote problem, and especially right now as migrants are being bused to New York, and the city is trying to get of the right of shelter, and people don't know where they're going to stay, and women mostly with children. So the question of homelessness in New York is big. But I was also surprised, as I said, this is the first time for me. I grew up in Lebanon, so this is the first time for me in this kind of geography part of the U.S. And I saw the homelessness yesterday, and I was like, but why? And when I was walking here, I thought about something that I was fascinated at. I teach a session on it about the money that goes into So what we're seeing on the screens right now, whether here or Iraq or before Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., the urban warfare. And you know, so much money, I don't know if you've read about that, but so much money goes into building towns in the deserts. I think there's one in Arizona, and there's one in California, and there's one in the Najaf. There's like all these training grounds for urban warfare. They're like Disneyland of Oriental, an Oriental reproduction of like Baghdad and Beirut and Gaza. And so these are built in like the deserts in California and Arizona, where Israeli and American soldiers are trained in urban warfare in the Middle East. And the question is, if you look up videos, there aren't many, they keep erasing them, but there are few that you find on YouTube. The question becomes is that it's like villages, it's like towns actually. And I was like, you put so much money to build these towns to train for like these wars that are so far removed and train other armies. Whereas this housing, because they're houses, they can be built somewhere else with the same budget for the homelessness and unhoused situation. So I don't know how money decides to be allocated. I know we keep going back to the global power, but yeah, they are not unrelated. They are related because people are deciding where to put that money, and that money is going to the Department of Defense instead of going to the housing situation. Thank you. Anything else? These were great questions. Thank you so much. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here, to engage with a new crowd, and feel free to email if you have any questions. Thank you so much.